Cremation had been on a Thursday. My daughter wanted a funeral home on the other side of town, something with white columns and a parking lot big enough for the people she planned to invite. I let her arrange it. Irene had always been particular about appearances, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to argue. I was 68 years old, and I'd just lost the woman I'd spent 41 years next to, and all I wanted was to sit somewhere quiet and not talk to anyone. The reception afterward was at my house. Irene's idea. She and her husband Craig moved through the rooms with a kind of ownership I hadn't noticed before, refilling drinks, directing people to the food table, telling the neighbors where to put their coats. At one point, I watched Craig stand in the doorway of my study and look around the room like he was taking inventory. I thought about that look for a long time afterward. My wife's name was Audrey. She taught high school English for 26 years in Dayton, Ohio, and she was the kind of woman who remembered the names of her students' dogs. She had a laugh that started slow and built up, and when she found something genuinely funny, she had to set down whatever was in her hands. I used to make her laugh on purpose just to watch her do it. She'd been diagnosed 18 months before she died. Pancreatic. We didn't tell Irene right away. Not because we were hiding it, but because Audrey wanted a few weeks where she didn't have to manage her daughter's feelings on top of her own. That was the kind of person she was. Even sick, she was thinking about everyone else's comfort first. When we did tell Irene, she cried, which was expected. Then, about 2 weeks later, she and Craig came to dinner, and Craig mentioned very casually that they'd been talking to a financial planner. Just to make sure everything is set up properly, he said, for when the time comes. I remember Audrey put her fork down very gently. She didn't say anything. She just looked at Craig for a moment, then looked at me, and then she picked her fork back up and changed the subject to something about their dog. That night, after they left, she sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing things down. I asked her what she was doing. She said she was thinking. I asked if she wanted company. She said not yet. She spent the next several months being very, very thoughtful. I didn't know the full extent of it until much later. In the weeks after the cremation, Irene called every day. I understood she was grieving too, and I tried to be patient. But the calls had a shape to them. They started with, "How are you, Dad?" and moved fairly quickly toward the house. Did I need help managing it? Had I thought about whether it made sense for one person to be in a 4-bedroom house alone? Had I considered that Craig's commute would be much shorter from this neighborhood? I hadn't considered that last one, no. Then one Sunday, she and Craig came over, and Craig brought a manila folder. Inside were some printed pages from a real estate website. Comparable homes in the area, recent sale prices. He set it on the kitchen table between us like it was a gift. "The market's good right now," he said. "You could get a lot for this place." "And go where?" I asked. "There are some really nice independent living communities," Irene said. She said it carefully, like she'd rehearsed it. "Not nursing homes, Dad. Nice places. Active adults. Pools, activities. I swim in my own backyard," I said. There was a pause. "The pole maintenance alone costs you," Craig started. "I know what it costs me," I said. "It's my pool." Irene reached across and put her hand over mine. "We're just worried about you." I looked at her hand on mine, and I thought about Audrey at the kitchen table with her legal pad. I thought about what she'd been doing all those months when I thought she was just thinking. "I appreciate that," I said. "I need some time." What Craig and Irene didn't know, what no one knew except me and a lawyer named Dwight, who'd been Audrey's college friend and now practiced estate law in Columbus, was that Audrey had not spent the last 18 months being resigned to anything. She had spent them being prepared. Audrey had written 4 novels. She published them quietly, under a pen name, starting about 12 years ago when she was still teaching. She never made a big thing of it. I knew, of course. I'd read every draft of every one of them, sitting up late at the kitchen table while she waited across from me pretending to grade papers. The books found a modest readership at first, then a bigger one, and by the time she was sick, they had been translated into 11 languages, and one of them had been optioned for television. The royalties came in quarterly. The previous year they had totaled just over $220,000. Irene didn't know about the pen name. She knew her mother had written something, the way you know a relative crochets, vaguely without detail. Audrey had never brought it up, but neither had I, because it was hers, and she was particular about it. What I also didn't know, until Dwight called me 3 weeks after the cremation, was that Audrey had restructured everything. The royalty income had been placed into a trust. My trust, structured so that it passed to me directly and was not part of the general estate that would eventually flow to Irene. The pen names publishing contracts, the foreign rights, the TV option, all of it was held by an LLC that Audrey had set up 2 years ago. Dwight had helped her do it quietly, methodically, during a period when Irene thought her mother was going to physical therapy twice a week. She was going to physical therapy once a week. The other appointment was Dwight's office. She was very organized, Dwight told me on the phone. He had a careful, measured voice, the kind that doesn't show much, but I thought I heard something in it. Respect, maybe. She wanted to make sure you had options. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that call, just looking out the back window at the pool. It was October. The leaves were coming down. I'd need to close it up soon. Audrey had also. I learned from a separate envelope Dwight mailed me, left me a letter. I won't share all of it. Some of it is just between us. But she wrote near the end, I know our daughter loves you. I also know that Craig sees a balance sheet when he looks at our life together. I don't want you to be managed, sweetheart. You've spent 40 years being the most capable man in any room. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise just because you're grieving. I read that part 4 times. Then I got my car and drove to the hardware store and bought what I needed to close up the pool for winter, because that was a thing I knew how to do, and I wanted to do something with my hands. The calls from Irene continued. Craig started coming with her on Sunday visits, which he hadn't done before. He was pleasant in the careful way that people are pleasant when they want something. He asked about my finances with what he must have imagined was subtlety. Did I have a financial advisor? Had I looked into whether the house might be better as a rental? What were my plans long term? My plan is to live in my house, I said. Of course, he said. Of course, he said. Of course, we just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed, I suggested. Yes, he said, seeming grateful for the word. I'm not overwhelmed, I said. Thank you for lunch. In January, Irene asked me directly whether I'd consider putting the house in her name for tax purposes. She had a whole explanation ready. Something about stepped-up basis and estate planning. Craig had clearly coached her on it. She said it wouldn't change anything, practically. I'd still live here. Nothing would change. It was just a paperwork thing. I told her I'd think about it. That night I called Dwight. Is that legal? I asked. The transfer itself would be legal, he said. What she's describing would essentially give her legal ownership of the house while you retain residency. The issue is that residency without legal ownership has no formal protection. If circumstances changed, if she decided she wanted me to leave, I said. A pause. For example, he said. What would you recommend? I'd recommend, Dwight said slowly, that you let me send you some documents to review. Audrey and I discussed a few contingencies. She had some thoughts. Of course she did. 2 weeks later, I had a full picture of what Audrey had actually arranged. The house in Dayton was in my name, had always been in my name, and nothing Irene had described would benefit me in the way she'd implied. Dwight had already drafted language that would hold the property in irrevocable trust during my lifetime, naming a different beneficiary of my choosing for afterward. He also told me gently that Audrey had left a specific note about this possibility. She had written, if anyone asks you to sign the house over for tax reasons, call Dwight first, then think about whether you'd like a change of scenery. Attached to the note was a deed, not to the Dayton house, to a piece of property in Vermont, a house on 11 acres outside a town called Hartwell, 40 minutes from Burlington. Audrey had bought it 8 years ago with royalty money, paid for it outright, and spent years having it slowly fixed up by a local contractor named Bud, who apparently knew Audrey from a writer's retreat she'd attended there and had kept the whole thing quiet because she'd asked him to and because he was, by all accounts, a man who knew how to keep his mouth shut. I'd been there once, actually. We'd taken a drive up that way in the fall, something like 10 years ago, and she'd slowed the car near a dirt road that turned off toward the mountains and said, "Isn't that something?" And I had agreed that yes, the foliage was beautiful, and then we'd driven on. I hadn't thought about it again. She'd bought it the following spring. The house had 3 bedrooms, a wood stove, a covered porch facing east toward the hills, and according to Bud, a very good well. The property taxes were manageable. There was a general store in town 8 minutes away, a library, a small hospital, 20 minutes out. The nearest city was Burlington, which had an airport and everything else a person might need. I sat with the deed for 3 days. On the fourth day, I called Irene and told her I'd thought about what she and Greg had suggested, and that I'd decided to do something different. I told her I was going to deed the Dayton house to her. She went very quiet. "You're serious," she said. "I am," I said. "It's a good house. It deserves to be used properly. You and Craig can decide what you want to do with it." She asked if I was sure. She asked if I'd talked to anyone. She asked, twice, whether I understood what I was doing. "I've had a lot of time to think," I said. Craig called me an hour later, warmer than he'd been in months. He asked if there was anything he could do to help with the transition, any way to make things easier. He mentioned the independent living communities again, but differently this time, more as a helpful resource than a directive. "I have somewhere in mind," I said. What Craig and Irene didn't know, and what I had no particular obligation to tell them, was that the Dayton house had not been maintained the way it appeared. Audrey and I had talked about renovating the kitchen and the master bath for years, and I'd always found something better to spend the money on. The roof had been patched in 2 places. The HVAC system was 14 years old. The pool, which Craig had once described as a real asset, required a full pump replacement that I'd been putting off. None of this was hidden. All of it would show up in a standard inspection. The house was real. The equity was real. It just wasn't the windfall Craig had been imagining when he'd printed those comparable listings from his laptop. There was also the matter of the royalties, the LLC, the trust, and the Vermont property, none of which were connected to the Dayton house in any legal or practical way. Those were mine. Audrey had made sure of it. I signed the deed on a Tuesday morning in Dwight's office. He handed me a pen and then leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "She'd have enjoyed this," he said. "I think so," I said. I drove back to Dayton, went through the house one more time, and packed what I wanted to take. It wasn't as much as I'd expected. The things that mattered most were smaller than I remembered. A photograph of Audrey from the summer we spent a week on Lake Erie, the year we were first married, a wooden box her father had made. My good cast iron pan, her handwriting on the legal pad she'd left in the kitchen drawer, a list of things she wanted me to remember to do, practical things, oil changes, and dentist appointments, and called Dwight, written like she'd be there to remind me if I forgot. I took that too. I got to Hartwell on a Friday, late afternoon. October again, almost exactly a year after I'd closed up the pool for the last time. Bud had left a key under the mat and a handwritten note on the kitchen counter saying the wood stove had been serviced, and there was a cord and a half of wood stacked behind the barn if I needed it. He'd also left a 6-pack of a local ale in the refrigerator, with a sticky note that said, "Welcome home." I stood in the kitchen for a moment. It smelled like wood smoke and old pine floors and something faintly sweet I couldn't identify. The windows faced west and hills were going gold in the late light. That particular Vermont October gold that looks like it shouldn't be a real color. I put the kettle on. There was a writing desk in the study, a real one, solid maple, that Audrey must have brought up here at some point. On top of it was a small frame photograph I hadn't packed. It had been here already. It was the two of us from a long time ago, maybe 1989, standing in front of a car I'd forgotten we owned, squinting into the sun somewhere. I don't remember who took it. I sat down in the chair behind the desk and looked at it for a while. My daughter called that evening. She and Craig had gone to look at the house and had some questions about the HVAC system. I answered the questions honestly. Craig mentioned a roofing estimate he'd gotten, and I said yes. The roof had been patched a couple of times, as I'd mentioned when we talked. He said he didn't remember that coming up. I said it must have slipped through. "Where are you now?" Irene asked. "Vermont," I said. A silence. "Vermont," she repeated. "It's beautiful this time of year," I said. "The foliage." She asked what I was doing in Vermont. I told her I'd bought a place a few years back, a little house in the hills, and that I'd always planned to spend some time here. She asked when I'd bought it. I said I'd have to look it up. "Dad." "I'm fine," I said. "I'm really fine. The house needs some work, but that's all right. There's a good contractor in town." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I was lonely. It was the first question she'd asked in a long time that wasn't about the house or the finances or my plans. It sounded like her, the real her, the daughter I'd taught to ride a bike in the driveway of that Dayton house 20 years ago. Not yet, I said, and that was honest. Ask me again in the spring. We stayed on the phone a little longer. I told her about the wood stove and the cord of wood and the general store in town. She told me about the dog, some small thing they'd gotten in the summer that she hadn't mentioned and I hadn't known about. We talked about Audrey for a few minutes, carefully, the way you do early on. After we hung up, I sat on the covered porch for a while in the cold. The stars out here were extraordinary. No ambient light for miles. I sat until I got too cold, then went inside and got the wood stove going, which took me 3 tries and then worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The royalties from Audrey's books would come in the following month, 200 and some $1,000, appearing in an account connected to an LLC registered in Delaware that bore a name no one but Dwight and I knew was connected to her. The television option was still active. The publisher had reached out about a 5th book. There were notes, apparently drafts, a nearly finished manuscript that Audrey had left with clear instructions about whether and how it could be completed. She had left instructions about nearly everything. I thought sometimes about what it must have cost her to spend those months planning instead of just being sick. Thinking about me, about logistics, about Dwight and deeds and LLCs, when she had every right to just be tired and scared and not take care of anyone. But that was who she was. She was thorough. She was quiet about the things that mattered. She did not announce herself. I understood her a little better now. In this house she'd furnished without me seeing it. On this land she'd walked without me. Looking at these hills she'd looked at while I thought she was getting her shoulder work done twice a week. She had been here. She had been here for years, in the small, steady way she did everything. And she had brought me here, in her way, at exactly the right time. I made tea and brought it out to the porch and watched the dark hills for a while. Then I went inside, found the legal pad in the bottom of my bag, and added a few things to her list that I thought she would have wanted me to remember. I've thought a lot about what Audrey was actually doing during those months when I thought she was just being sick. She was being deliberate, quietly, without any announcement, without asking for credit or comfort. She was building something that would outlast her, not just the trust, not just the Vermont property or the LLC or the royalties. She was building a way for me to remain myself after she was gone. That's the part that takes my breath away, even now. She wasn't protecting assets. She was protecting the person she'd spent 41 years with, making sure grief didn't leave me exposed to people who would confuse my loss for weakness. Craig and Irene didn't set out to be cruel. I believe that. But there's a kind of entitlement that grows so gradually in people that they stop being able to see it. By the time they sat across my kitchen table with those printed real estate listings, they genuinely thought they were helping. That's the thing about self-interest dressed up as concern. It fools the person wearing it just as much as anyone else. What they couldn't account for was Audrey. They'd never taken her seriously enough to account for her. She wrote 4 novels that earned $250,000 a year, and her own daughter didn't know her pen name. She bought land in Vermont and furnished a house and had a contractor drive over from town every few months for years, and I didn't know either. She held all of that quietly, not out of secrecy, but because she understood that some things stay whole only when you don't subject them to other people's opinions. She was the most private person I ever knew, and also the most present. Those 2 things can exist together in someone. In her, they did. I think about the legal pad she left in the kitchen drawer. The list of practical things. Oil changes, dentist, called Dwight. It looks on the surface like the kind of thing anyone might leave behind. But she knew I'd find it. She knew I'd sit at that table and read it in her handwriting and that it would feel like her hand on my shoulder. She was thinking about what I would need in the specific, ordinary moments that grief makes unbearable. Not the big ones. The Tuesday mornings. The quiet Sundays. That's wisdom. Not the kind you read about, but the kind that lives in the details of how a person treats someone else every day for 40 years. I'm not a person who believes that things work out the way they're supposed to, necessarily. I've seen enough of life to know that outcomes don't always match effort or intention, but I do believe that how you choose to act, steadily, honestly, without cruelty, without performing generosity you don't feel, as a way of compounding over time into something real. Audrey's choices compounded into 11 acres in Vermont and a maple writing desk, and a note that said, "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise just because you're grieving." Craig will figure out eventually that the Dayton house is not what he thought it was. Irene will feel whatever she feels about Vermont. I can't control that, and I don't spend much time trying to. What I can do is get the wood stove going in 3 tries instead of 5. Learn the name of the man who runs the general store. Find out if the library in Hartwell needs volunteers on Thursdays. Keep adding to the legal pad. Audrey left me a life. The least I can do is live it.